The views and opinions expressed in this broadcast are those of the speakers or authors and do not necessarily reflect or represent the views and opinions held by the producers of this broadcast. The material herein is for entertainment purposes only.
Welcome to another episode of Scary's Paranormal Radio. Tonight, we have with us our guest, a gentleman by the name of Toast. And Toast is one of our beloved Haunted History Tours tour guides, and he is also a very knowledgeable historian, and he is a DJ. And Toast is here to talk to us about some of those things that we might be seeing on these photographs that we're getting down in this area of New Orleans that I consider to be a portal to the other side. Welcome, Toast.
Thank you, Kalila. Pleasure to be here.
Yes, I'm very honored to have you here. And, you were mentioning to me about some of these spirits. Give people a little bit of a detail of a little bit of your history. What is your background? What is your history? And just kind of tell us a little bit about you.
Okay. Well, I was raised Jewish in a small town in New York. I was raised conservative Jewish, which means that not Orthodox, not extremely observant. In high school, I went to Israel, which is where a lot of Jewish boys, particularly, wind up because it is considered a good deed to go to Israel. And there, I rediscovered some of my Jewish roots and became more observant. And then eventually, I discovered that in my belief, what I was doing was out of guilt and shame, and that is not what I believe God wants us to do things for. He wants us to be good people and not do things out of guilt and shame. Started getting things like piercings and shaving parts of my head, which is which is frowned upon, particularly in Orthodox and traditional Judaism. And so now I consider myself a spiritual person, and what that means to me is that I do believe that there is a higher power, and I just add things to my spiritual toolbox from any path that I encounter, including Native American. And we here in New Orleans do have a city that is steeped in voodoo, and so voodoo has become part of that as well. And it's just they're all ways to get to a higher power. They're all ways, in my experience and in my belief, they're all ways of getting to a power that is greater than ourselves. So that's my background, and I feel like I was called to New Orleans, as a lot of people are, and it is said that New Orleans is not only a welcoming mother, but she's a spiteful bitch. And so if you spurn her, she will come right back at you. And my experience in New Orleans thus far has been that she absolutely wants me here. I experience her as a living, breathing, spiritual city and part of my spirituality. And there's a reason that I'm here. And as I've stayed here, for instance, Voodoo Loa and other spirits have made themselves known to me. And so I know that I belong here. And part of that involves sharing the city that I love with people on our tours and learning as much as I possibly can, not only about the city, but one of my particular interests is the history of Judaism in New Orleans. And with that, the paranormal and the spiritual aspects of that here in New Orleans. So, long introduction, but there you go.
No, that's great. No, and it's important to point that out. And you're right. I mean, we've always said, and I'm a native from New Orleans, and it's always been said, New Orleans either embraces you or she rejects you, mm-hmm. and that's always been the way it is. You're either welcome with open arms or she devours you. And it's true. I mean, people will come here and they absolutely will get eaten alive by things if they're not welcome, or if they're doing things they're not supposed to be doing or disrespect things. So no. And New Orleans definitely loves you, and Haunted History Tours loves you. And
thank you.
We all appreciate you and everything. So, but On the previous show, we had Charmaine, the other tour guide, one of the other tour guides on here, and we were discussing some of the phenomena that happens in some of the cemeteries here, some of our above ground cemeteries. And I've been doing paranormal research for over 25 years professionally. And it's been proven time and time again. I mean, you don't get full-bodied apparition on photographs, but since we started going around some of these cemeteries at the base of Canal Street, surprisingly enough, I have seen things with my eyes, with just right in front of my face, people there and then they disappear. I've seen people walk away and then just it's as if they walk through another dimension. I've had things come onto photographs I've taken that I know nothing was there. So I'm seeing things that I've never seen before in the many years that I've done this, and it's amazing to me. And now I'm going, okay, what is that and why? But as you are aware, you're familiar with some of the photographs that were taken in one particular cemetery. And we don't give out the names, folks, because these are sometimes stops on a tour, and we don't give out the locations or anything. And many of these cemeteries we are not allowed to go inside, so we just go by them. But we do get photographs. But some of these places, I mean, some of those things. One of that thing looked like a little tiny, miniature Grim Reaper. And it was behind the fence. I mean, it was like, you can't say it was an app, because clearly, I used to be a professional photographer. I can look at something and see the depth of range. Like here's the woman, she's standing in front of this gate. Well, this thing is behind the fence. You couldn't have put an app back there. I mean, and it's like, okay, what is that thing? I don't know what it is. I am very familiar with the spirits in the voodoo tradition, the Gede, who guard the burial grounds, and they can be absolutely fierce if you disrespect the cemeteries, but I'm not familiar with some of the other traditions. And in this particular case, this was a Jewish cemetery where some of these figures have shown up. Correct. So you had mentioned something, and I'd like you to share with us some of these spiritual beings in the Judaism tradition, because some of us are not aware of it. I was married to a Jewish man for many, many years, and I never heard of any of this stuff. So I am intrigued, and I'm sure everybody else will be as well.
Okay, well, most Jewish people are not aware of the presence and the role that demons and ghosts and spirits play in Judaism. And one of the reasons for that is because these do not appear in mainstream Judaism. I've actually had people on the tour, when we pull up in front of this particular Jewish cemetery, that said, I'm Jewish and we don't believe in ghosts, which is not true. But these are things when you start getting into the Talmud and the Kabbalah. And so some people may not be aware of what the Talmud is. So we have the Torah, which is the 5 books of Moses, and the prophets, which most people know as the Old Testament. And then the Talmud is actually the discussion of the Torah. And then there's discussion upon discussion upon discussion, because Jews really like to talk. We love the sound of our own voices, and we love arguing. Now, the Torah is open for interpretation.
I have to laugh at that.
Yeah, it's true. The Torah is open for interpretation, because what some people don't know is that the Torah was written in Hebrew that does not have vowels. Some of it is written in Hebrew, and some of it is written in Aramaic. And when you look at that, you can look, and it's kind of like if you have a word in English that only has consonants but no vowels. And so you can look at that and say, well, this could be this word, this could be that word. So throughout the centuries, rabbis have been looking at that, and based on contextual things and where those words appear in other places, what does that word mean? So a fine example of that is, for instance, the reason why people believe that Jews have horns is because when the Bible was translated, when the Old Testament was translated, some people believe when it was first translated into a Germanic form, when Moses comes down from Mount Sinai, and the word can either be translated as rays, as in rays of light, came from his head, or as horns came from his head. And so it was kind of convenient for people, since Jews were considered the children of Satan, thanks to things like Revelations, that Jews have horns, and that we are the children of Satan. So, that's one of the more well-known ones. So if you look at, for instance, Michelangelo's statue of Moses and of David, they have horns. Of course, horns were also meant to show that you were very knowledgeable, or that you were a sage, which is suspect at best. So the Talmud is a body of Jewish ceremonial law and legend, which is from the 5th century. So you have that. Then you have what's known as halacha or halacha, which is Jewish law derivative from the Talmud. It was also known as the oral Torah, and it was finally written down because, if you're passing things on orally and people die before you get that, well, then it's lost. And then you have Kabbalah, which a lot of people have become familiar with thanks to people like Madonna. It's become very hip. And that is the Jewish tradition of mysticism, and it is an interpretation of the Torah through mysticism. So when you start looking at the Talmud and you start looking at the Kabbalah, that's where these demons and that's where these spirits start showing up. Now, a lot of people believe, and Jewish people believe, that there's no afterlife. There are a number of different thoughts about that. Some people believe that when you die, that is the end of the journey. And there are other thoughts that say that death does not end the soul's journey, that it sticks around, that it comes back to us. And once again, these are not part of mainstream Judaism. So if you're brought up the way that I was, you would not talk about the afterlife if you went to synagogue. You would not talk about demons. You would not talk about spirits. And if you ask most Jews if we believe in ghosts, they say absolutely not, which is not true. So that's the beginning of the whole thing. And it's also believed that if you study Kabbalah before you're 40, that you're going to go insane. If you and women in particular are not supposed to study Kabbalah at all or Talmud at all. Because, these things were written by men, and men like to keep women in their place. Showing my feminists there. But, so anyway.
But that was more of a cultural thing of that time as well. So it was kind of the cultural norm.
It's definitely a cultural norm at the time, but for instance, in Orthodox Judaism, it is still, for instance, in Hasidim, which most people know as the guys with the payas, the curls on the side, and the tall hats and the long coats, even in warm weather, women are still not allowed to study the Talmud or to study the Kabbalah. So there's that. Now, one of the interesting things is that there are 5 books of Moses. That is the Old Testament. There are the 6th and the 7th books of Moses. There's actually the 8th book of Moses. What's interesting about these is that these did not appear until the 18th century in Germany, and it was thought that these books actually were hidden. They were actually written by Moses, and that these books are a grimoire or a text of magical incantations and seals to perform the miracles of the Bible. And most people don't know about that. Most people don't know about the fact that there is magic in Judaism. And once again, mainstream Judaism, and way back in the Old Testament, it was said that you could not communicate with death. You could not practice divination. It was sinful. A lot of these things came from the fact that the Jewish people, the Israelites, were surrounded by pagan tribes, and we didn't want to do anything that resembled pagan tribes. But so when you start doing research about the appearance of spirits and of demons, it is actually in the Old Testament. So, for instance, Saul is visited by an evil spirit in the book of Samuel. There are sources of these, and some rabbis, some Jewish scholars will say that he wasn't actually visited by an evil spirit, that he was having a dream or that he was sick in some way, because in a lot of cultures, demons and being visited by spirits is a sign of insanity. Of course, in some other cultures, people that communicate with the spirits are considered holy men. So it's all where you fall on this. So, for instance, there's the line that "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live," which is in Psalms, and that was used as a way to burn witches throughout the centuries. But if you look at the actual text, it can be interpreted as, since what we're getting is a gift from a higher power, you should not charge usury, you should not charge large rates for this gift. You are simply opening yourself up as a portal, as a conduit for God to communicate through these things. It's also interesting then when you look at, like, Moses communicating with God and performing all sorts of miracles in Egypt, which is pertinent because we're entering Passover tonight. He was able to perform these things and to compete with the magicians in Egypt. So obviously there is magic. Obviously there are people that are communicating in certain ways. So, sorry, I get really excited about this stuff.
No,
so
this is great. This is fascinating.
I'm going to ramble.
No, go. Ramble away. It's wonderful.
So, for instance, in that photo that you're talking about, and we when we were able to get into that cemetery without naming any cemeteries, we would go in there and people were actually making offerings to Lawa and burning and burning candles in there for Lawa, and we would see money spread out as an offering, which is kind of, I would giggle at that because I'm like, you're going at that point, you're going to the hardware store for milk. I understand that the Gede are everywhere, but this is a Jewish cemetery.
Right.
Now,
people don't understand that they're guardians, but there's also cultural ties to that. I mean, it's indigenous spirits that are tied to certain things. In other words, years ago we did an investigation in Slidell, and there were some indigenous spirits in a cemetery there, and that happened to be a heavy Choctaw area. So we're not going to bring a voodoo priestess there to deal with that, because it was not voodoo spirits that were being offended. It was Choctaw spirits. So we brought someone in who had Choctaw ties, and they could you have to stick with the traditions. People don't understand that. So you're not going to find those spirits in a Jewish cemetery. You're going to find the spirits that are of those people, of those spiritual paths, if it makes sense.
Right. So let's talk about that for a moment, because once again, we were able to go into that particular cemetery. Long story, guys. I don't want to bore you with that or smack talk on this. However, we did have permission to enter that cemetery, and the interesting thing is that there would be a few different tour guides from our company, and they're at the same time. I'm Jewish. They're not. There are parts of that cemetery that I could go into and be comfortable, and they could not. There was definitely a nope, you don't belong here. And the spirits in that cemetery realized that we were all there to be respectful. However, me being Jewish meant that I gained access to parts of that cemetery that other people did not. Now, there were parts of that cemetery that none of us liked to go in because it was uncomfortable, because these spirits are very unhappy. So one of the reasons for that, as you know, Khalil, and some people don't, is that we had something here in New Orleans called Code Noir, translated as Black Code, and it dictated how our enslaved people would be treated here. But the first thing that Code Noir said was that all Jews would be expelled from the colony of New Orleans. And that meant that Jewish people had to hide, had to change their ways, had to change their names, as a matter of fact. There is a Jewish family that adopted our very own Louis Armstrong, who had to change their names from Karnofsky to Carno, so that they were not expelled. So these spirits are upset by that, and they're upset by some of the desecration in the cemetery. because the cemetery is open and people go in cemeteries and they do a lot of disrespectful things, and these spirits are very upset by that. My personal opinion is that when we were no longer able to enter that cemetery, the spirits really wanted to make sure that they were seen and heard by us. And so when we would pull up there, they made sure that we knew that they were there. But let's talk about that particular photograph that you're talking about. Because in that photograph, there's not only one, there are a number, there's a lot going on in there. But the one that you're talking about, for those of you that are fans of Nightmare Before Christmas, it looks like a black Oogie Boogie.
Only it's very tiny. It's a mini one. It's a mini Oogie Boogie.
No, it's I don't know. I've looked at the photograph recently. It is taller than the woman.
Well, it looks short because it's over behind that fence. If we're talking about the same photograph.
We're talking about the same photograph, and there are a number of different things in the photograph. But this is, well, yeah, obviously Oogie Boogie is huge, so it's not as big as Oogie Boogie. But that's it's not much shorter than the woman. And you're right, it is. When you look at the photograph, there's no way it was photoshopped because she's in front of the gate. You can see the figure behind the gate. You can she would have to be a master manipulator of photography. And once again, she showed us this picture right after she took this picture.
Yeah.
Which means that, yeah, she did not add it to the picture afterwards. And there's a lot going on there. And so my fellow tour guides and I started talking about what this might be. And one of the things that we came up with was that it might be a Dybbuk.
Stay tuned for more Scariest Paranormal Radio.
Submitted for your approval. New Orleans. Seductive, magical, mysterious, and haunted. There is no place on this earth with as much ghost and vampire activity as New Orleans. Imagine, if you will, a tour that takes you to sites in the French Quarter of actual documented hauntings. The Haunted History Tour is just that tour. Every day, every night, all year round. This tour has been featured on ABC, CBS, NBC, and CNN, and it's available to you. Are there ghosts and vampires in the French Quarter? Find out by taking the tour that everyone is talking about, the Haunted History Tour. For more information, call Haunted History Tours at 861-2727. That's 861-2727. This is not a Halloween spookhouse. This is real.
You're listening to Scariest Paranormal Radio.
Let's talk about Dybbuks. Dybbuks are not really demons. They are detached spirits, or they're detached souls. And they can either possess a living person, or they can attach themselves to a soul that has lost its way. Dybbuks are inherently evil. They are mean. But because whenever we have good and evil, there's so the Dybbuks are the evil side, and then we have Ebors. Ebors are positive spirits that possess a living person. So, for instance, a Dybbuk will attach itself to a soul and do evil. An Ebor will attach itself to a soul because they have some unfinished business and they want to do some sort of good deed. In Hebrew, that's called a mitzvah. And an Ebor is something that will attach, complete this task, and then move on. So, what we came up with is that might be a Dybbuk. And for those of you that are fans of wonderful shows like Ghost Adventures, there's something called the Dybbuk box, which there's an object called the Dybbuk box. It's actually a wine cabinet, and you can trap the Dybbuk in there, and then if you open it, well, then the Dybbuk comes out. And there's one in particular that was sold on eBay, and everybody that had it had something bad happen to them. Of course, they did open it because they said, well, we want to make sure that the Dybbuk's still in there, or whatever it was. Curiosity killed the cat. Satisfaction brought it back. And so they opened up the box, and then obviously the Dybbuk was free and followed them around, whoever owned the box. So that's one of the things that we came up with. But so in Judaism, so once again, you're talking about the Talmud here. You're not talking about mainstream Judaism and things that most people will not go on and read. Most people don't sit down and read the Talmud because, frankly, it's just commentary upon commentary upon commentary, and it's very, very boring. So there are two different types of demons that you will find in the Talmud. So you have Shadim. Shadim are either considered the descendants of the serpent or descendants of Adam and Lilith. For those of you who don't know, Adam had a first wife. Her name was Lilith. Lilith was the first feminist, and Adam resented the fact that she was made out of the same soil that he was made out of, and that she refused to be underneath him. And when I say underneath him, I mean in all the ways that you can possibly think of a woman being underneath a man. As a result, she was expelled from, either she was expelled or she sprouted wings and she flew out of Eden. And so then Adam's second wife, he was not able to see how she was created, but the myth is that he was created from her, she was created from his rib, which made her not only part of him, but underneath him. So thanks to the fact that Lilith was expelled or left Eden, she became not only the queen of the demons, or she was considered the first vampire, which is interesting. So in Mesopotamian and in Jewish folklore, Lilith is considered the first vampire. And one of the ways that she would get back at people was by sneaking into their homes and eating their babies. Yum. So either the Shadim are descendants of the serpents, coming from the first serpent who, produced sin in the Garden of Eden, or they are the descendants of Adam and Lilith. They have the feet of a rooster. They cause sickness and misfortune. They also follow the dead, and they fly around graves, which means that what we see in this picture might be one of the Shadim. And then we have Mazikeen. If you're a fan of the show Lucifer, yes, Mazikeen from Lucifer. They are damagers or those that cause harm. Then we have Se'irim, which are hairy beasts. And we do have a demon-like thing which appears in the Old Testament, Azazel, who is a goat demon, also considered the scapegoat. So one of the reasons that demons seem to appear as goats in the Jewish religion is because they would literally have two goats, one that had all the good things that they did, one that had all the bad things that they did. They would write their sins on the goat, and then sometimes they would drive them off of a cliff so that their sins would go with that goat. So those are some of the ways that demons appear. Babylonian Jews believe that the world is filled with demons. Everything, including if you leave crumbs on the counter, it will be possessed by a demon. The king of the demons is Asmodeus, and his wife is Agrat Bat Bahilat. So Bat means daughter in Hebrew. So if you start looking around at the Talmud and at the Kabbalah, you do see these demons and you do see these spirits. Any questions thus far?
No, it's very, very interesting.
Okay.
Now, what was the one that you said caused harm? And
oh, that is Mazikeen. Mazikeen. So once again, there's a show called Lucifer. Interesting concept, and in it, his right hand woman is a demon whose name is Mazikeen, and Mazikeen is just a overall term for demons that are they are damagers or those that harm. That's what it's translated as.
Now, I do have a question here, and I think maybe some other people who are listening might as well.
Sure.
And I come from Catholic roots. Okay, I come from Catholic roots, so it's a little bit different. Of course, I'm familiar with the Old Testament, but Now, where do these demons fall in the realm? Because, I mean, what I was taught and what a lot of people were taught who are of my spiritual background, what we were taught was, that Satan was Lucifer, who was an angel, fallen angels, the whole 9 yards, and that there were a certain amount of major demons, such as Baal.
Mm-hmm.
What's the other one? Beelzebub, who
Right.
is the one who brings disease, as we sit here in the midst of a pandemic. Now, where do these demons that you're speaking of, where do they fall in the big? I mean, I'm sure, like everything else, there's probably thousands upon thousands of different kinds of demonic spirits, but where do they fall in the range of these other spirits? I guess these are other demons that are more major. I mean, how does that?
Okay.
Is there like a hierarchy where that falls, or how does that work?
Well, I'd be lying if I told you, because, I come from a Jewish background. I don't really know about demonology in Catholicism. And,
it comes
obviously
from the Old Testament, and that's
right.
where I'm confused, is because that came from the Jewish part of our Bible. So I'm very confused on that. That's kind of like in the very beginning, this is what happened. I think it came from Ezekiel, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not a Bible scholar, so I might be wrong.
So,
but I think it's in Ezekiel.
So if you don't know, one of the ways that Satan is translated is as the adversary, and first appears in Eden, with the serpent, and then if you read the book of Job, Satan goes to Job and wants to test his faith in God, but there's not once again in mainstream Judaism, there's not a whole lot of conversations about Satan or sin in general. I mean, you get to, like Yom Kippur, and you are actually confessing to every sin that every Jew ever could have committed. But the idea of sin as a way that you're not going to get into heaven, now that gets into another sticky wicket, because a lot of Jews don't believe that there is an afterlife, that you die and that's it. Some people believe that there's a purgatory. Some people believe that there's an awful place that you go to and you burn for a little while and then you go to heaven. But I'm sort of evading the question because I don't know. I don't know.
Okay, fair enough. No, hey, fair enough. It's something we can look at in another show. I mean, I can go look it up and I can address this at another show, because it's been a long time since I read all of that stuff. But I know that was there were I think 7 major demons that roamed the earth. But I mean, certainly there were other ones. So I was just kind of curious as to where these fell, if there were a different realm, or like in the voodoo tradition, you have your Loa, and you have your Rata and your Petro. Your Rata being the cooler, more healing spirits, a little bit higher up to God's consciousness, maybe, and then the other ones are hotter, more fiery. But then you have your Gede, who are not as high up to God's consciousness. They're considered to be closer to our earthly plane. So that's why they're faster acting. But they're not as highly evolved as they're not considered highly evolved or higher up to God's consciousness. And that's why people leave them money, because they're more on an earth plane. And that's why people use them for trials and court cases and so forth. So I was just curious if these were like lesser demons, and are they specifically in cemeteries? That would be another question that I have.
No, not all of them are specifically in cemeteries. There are some that just hover over graves, and then most of them, they interact in the human world. So, for instance, if you're talking about a Dybbuk, now a Dybbuk can be in a cemetery because that's where the souls are. So, one belief is that the soul hovers over the body as it's decomposing in a Jewish cemetery, and that the headstone gives the soul a place to reside, and that particular aspect of the soul is known as the nefesh. And so it would make sense, going back to that picture once again, that if there are souls that are hovering over the cemetery, And there are people that are going into that cemetery doing things that they ought not do. Disrespecting, or bringing in the law. Now, in Judaism, we are very, very, very sensitive to people doing pagan type things in a Jewish realm. So it's not beyond it's not beyond thinking that if people were going in there and leaving offerings to gods, I know that the law are not gods, they're spirits, that are not from the Jewish faith, that might bring a Dybbuk in.
Right.
Because,
that makes sense.
Because then you're talking about people that are doing what is in the eyes of Judaism is evil. It's outside of the realm of Judaism. And so that would invite a Dybbuk to attach itself to a soul that is confused, that is wandering in that cemetery. And so it's also believed that one of the ways that you keep demons in a home, for instance, is to close the windows. So you open the windows, because if you close it out, so when they started locking that particular cemetery, that meant it was a closed environment. So that means if demons were present there, they didn't have a way to get out any longer. And so there's actually one particular rabbi in his last will and testament. He said, "You open the windows in my house because I do not want to trap demons in my house." Just once again, following that, what is it in that particular photograph that we're talking about? And if you follow that, once again, people are going into that cemetery doing things that they shouldn't do. Doing things that are considered sinful, that are outside of Judaism. You have spirits that are already upset because they've been oppressed, because they've been kicked out, because they've been killed, because they can't practice their religion in this life, which means that you have that residue in the afterlife. You have this unfinished business. Right. So if you have these spirits that have this unfinished business and they're hanging around anyway because you have the gravestones, which is where they're residing. You put stones on headstones to weigh down the soul so it doesn't pass on too quickly. So you have souls that are ripe for the taking for a Dybbuk if a Dybbuk did want to go into that cemetery. So once again, if you look at that photo, so the Dybbuk type figure, if you're looking at this woman, it would be on her right, inside the cemetery to be on her left. Which is interesting because, right is considered the good side and left is considered the bad side. The Dybbuk appears on the left side. But then if you look over her shoulder again, there is something that looks like a devil. It has horns. It has a beard. So then
I didn't see that. I'm gonna have to blow that picture up a bit. Yeah.
When we're able to see each other in person, I will point out all these things. There's a lot going on in that photograph.
Wow.
So then when you're looking at that, it looks like a goat demon. It could be Azazel. Azazel usually wanders in the wilderness. But once again, there's a lot of confusing things going around in there. So you could have a Shedim, which follows the dead and flies around the graves. And they are considered evil because they are the cause of sickness and misfortune, and they are they are descendants not only serpents or of Adam and Lilith. Now it's considered that the Shedim were actually meant to be human, but God started creating the Shedim, and then He took a day off for the Sabbath, and so they never became human. They became these confused creatures. So those are the three, in my mind, those are the three things that it could possibly be. It could be a Shedim. It could be Azazel. It could be a Dybbuk, which are going on in that photograph.
Wow.
Yeah. There's a lot of things that could be going on. Now, not completely off of the subject, but just something interesting that some people may not know is the term abracadabra, which is synonymous with abracadabra, you're doing a trick, actually comes from a Hebrew phrase. which is Avra Kedavra, which means I create as I speak.
Yep.
Because one of the things about creation is if you look at the Torah, it says, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. And Kabbalists and other people believe that the word is the power. When you speak, something happens. It's also believed that there are numerical values for all the Jewish letters, and that the universe is made up out of Jewish letters. So if you perform this rite, if you perform this ritual, this magic, and you say abracadabra, I create as I speak. One of the ways that was used is creating something called a golem. And when you and I spoke, I alluded to this.
That's
right.
The one you had mentioned. Now that you say that again, I remember now.
All right. Y'all know what a golem is because most of us have read a little story called Frankenstein. Because in Frankenstein, he takes something that is inanimate and puts life back into it. And that's what a golem is. A golem means that you're taking clay or soil, shaping it into a human form, and then breathing life into it, giving it a soul. So when you say abracadabra and you're breathing, I create as I speak. So the words are the power. It's a golem was actually supposed to be created by somebody, and it was to do their will. And oftentimes a golem was created to protect a village because they're not really alive. You can't kill them. So if you send out a golem, which is a big hulking thing against anti-Semitic forces or people that are meant to cause you harm, it's something that can't be killed. So if you're going up against something that can't be killed and it just keeps coming, well, you're going to lose. The problem is that a lot of golems would then become confused and lose their path. And so even though they were created for good, oftentimes they actually went out and they started creating havoc, going out into the villages, being chased out with pitchforks and torches and all that fun stuff, which is, what happened in Frankenstein. So you do have golems as well. I don't believe that's a golem. And there have been plays about golems, and they've appeared in various shows, like the X-Files had a golem in it. I'm sure that Supernatural probably has a show about a golem. But that's where most people would know it from. That's what Frankenstein was based on, was a golem.
Interesting.
Stay tuned for more Scariest Paranormal Radio.
Submitted for your approval. New Orleans. Seductive, magical, mysterious, and haunted. There is no place on this earth with as much ghost and vampire activity as New Orleans. Imagine, if you will, a tour. A tour that takes you to sites in the French Quarter of actual documented hauntings. The Haunted History Tour is just that tour. Every day, every night, all year round. This tour has been featured on ABC, CBS, NBC, and CNN. And it's available to you. Are there ghosts and vampires in the French Quarter? Find out by taking the tour that everyone is talking about. The Haunted History Tour. For more information, call Haunted History Tours at 861-2727. That's 861-2727. This is not a Halloween spookhouse. This is real.
You're listening to Scariest Paranormal Radio.
Wow, this is a lot. Yeah, this is just amazing. Most of this stuff I've never heard of. The abracadabra I have heard of.
Yeah.
I definitely have heard of that and was aware of that. And that's applied in so many school of thoughts as far as, people creating what they say. I mean, and you have to be careful not only what you say, but what you think, because if you the power of the spoken word, and I don't know, I've never read the Torah, but like I said, I've read the Old Testament, and of course, in the Catholic faith, and I guess in all of Christianity, it's the Word of God. They're always talking about the Word of God, the Word.
Mm-hmm.
This is the Word, and and it's very powerful, the Word. And so, just be careful what you say and be careful what you think. So in closing, I mean, if, I know people are going to wonder if somebody goes near one of these places, or, when we open back up, they take a tour, they go to a cemetery. Do people have to worry about one of these things coming home with them?
Well,
the average person, not the person that goes and does stupid things. As long as you're not doing something stupid, you're just innocently, innocuously taking a tour, getting information, taking some pictures. Do people have to worry about something like this attaching to them?
It very rarely happens, but it does happen. That's an honest answer. It does happen. My advice to people when entering any cemetery is be respectful, because most spirits will realize that you're there to be respectful. If you start acting like a jackass, well, then that invites a lot of things to do. I mean, things like drinking alcohol do make you more receptive, and people do that in New Orleans. But my advice is always be respectful, and that minimizes the chances something is going to follow you home. As far as in a Jewish cemetery, as I said, a dybbuk could actually attach itself to people. It can. I've never seen it happen on one of our tours, but it could happen.
But generally, this is not going to happen if you're being respectful.
Oh, no.
And one of the reasons that all the cemeteries are now locked up is because people were not being respectful.
Right.
It's also the reason why on the bus tour we no longer allow people to bring alcohol.
Right.
Because people were getting a bit out of hand and behaving wrongly in the cemetery and doing things they weren't supposed to do. And there were other groups going in as well that were not that did not have permission to go in. Who were a lot less respectful. And you
could feel the energy shift. There's one at least particular place that I could feel when entering that particular cemetery if somebody was there before us. Because once again, I think that our tour guides are very unique, not just patting ourselves on the back, but we're about respect, and we teach our groups to be respectful. And so some of the spirits got to know us in those cemeteries, and they realized that it was us, as opposed to the other ones that were. I sort of. It's sort of like entering somebody's house when they're asleep, and you start going through their cupboards and going into closets and going through their personal stuff. They're going to get angry. The same thing happens with the spirits in the cemetery. That is their home. People may not know this, but the term cemetery comes from the Greek root is a term for the sleeping place or the resting place. This is their final resting place. You are entering their home. That is their turf, and you act respectfully there. And if you don't, then they will show you they were upset. And that's happened as well. So, but once again, particularly because of the history of oppression in Judaism and the history of oppression of Jews in New Orleans, it's particularly important to be respectful, especially if you're not Jewish when entering a Jewish cemetery or even approaching a Jewish cemetery, because it makes a difference. It makes a big difference.
All right. Well, Toast, thank you so much. And folks, when Haunted History Tours does open back up, you can request Toast, or if you have a private tour, you can also request Toast. Just drop us a line at webmistress@hauntedhistorytours.com and say, hey, when's Toast working? And we can make sure you get on Toast's tour. Also, Toast, tell us where people can find you. He also is a DJ, and you have some regular gigs when things open back up down here, right?
I do, yeah. And I'm actually doing virtual streaming things as people do. So you can find me at Bashert Productions. That's Bashert Productions on Facebook, and I announce them there. If you don't know, beshert is actually a term for the person that you're meant to be with in Judaism. And so I founded my company. I married my wife, and it was meant to be. Beshert Productions. And also, I don't know if this is possible, Kalila, but if people do have questions about anything that I talked about on here, and they're able to contact you, I'd be happy to do a follow-up or to answer those questions, because it's a lot of information.
Well, actually, we have. Yeah, well, I have a Facebook called Scary's Paranormal, and I'll send you that link for that, and they can send questions there if they want, and then I'll make sure you get them.
Absolutely.
Awesome. All
right.
Thank you, Toast. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so very much. This was amazing.
You're welcome.
Thank you. All right, guys, have a great night, and we'll see you next week. Thank you.
Be well, guys.